Read this gravestone and the marker next to it. You might think I'm in Massachusetts or upstate New York, except I'm in Grand Rapids, Ohio, less than 25 miles from where you're sitting right now. Read what we've got on here. A. Morrison, U.S. soldier, Rev. War, 1776. The long-lasting effects of the Revolutionary War didn't just affect people in the 13 colonies. The veterans and the effects of the war spread out over the rest of the country as it is today, including where we live. So join me today as we talk a little bit about the lasting effects and influences of the American Revolution. So with that said, let's talk about the Revolution. Now, the Revolution starts out with some pretty confusing vocabulary almost from the beginning. We start out with the idea of what do we call the different sides in this war? Because in many ways, if we were talking about this in any other context, we would be calling the people who created America insurrectionists, right? They were British subjects living on British territory under British law who decided to fight their own government. We have a word for that, and it's treason, okay? So from one perspective, the perspective of the British, these are treasonous British subjects. They call themselves patriots, okay? Now, that's complicated, right? Because we understand the word patriotism to mean a person who has a deep love of country. Well, these are folks who apparently no longer did have a deep love of their home country of Britain, but do have a deep love of the new country they believe they're creating, the United States of America. Or perhaps even more plainly put, Thomas Jefferson sees himself as a Virginia patriot. John Adams, to some degree, sees himself as a Massachusetts patriot. Okay? So when we use the word patriot in relation to the Revolutionary War, understand that we're talking about people who were patriotic to this new nation and new cause. But the other people who are involved in this story are still patriotic to other countries. So, the people who remained patriotic to Great Britain, we call loyalists, okay? They stayed loyal to the crown. They were not an unsubstantial number of people. By some estimates, 15 to 20% of people residing, and again, people who were not Native Americans, were staying loyal to the British Crown. 15 to 20% are loyal to the Crown. Another estimated 20% of people were unsure, right? They kind of want to see, how's this going to settle out? Who's going to win? I don't know who I want to back in this thing. So add those together, and maybe 60% of the country was really enthusiastically patriot. Now, these people ran the show, okay? And they made life hell for the loyalist people. And they did everything they could to get the people on the fence to come over to their general direction. And in an activity we're going to do, you're going to kind of see where the strongholds of loyalist fever were and where the strongholds of patriot fever were. Now, as we're looking at the beginning of the war, who's going to win this thing? Anybody who was betting would have said Great Britain is going to win this thing in a couple of weeks, okay? Britain had one of the top 3 armies in the Western world. And it was an army that had just been exceedingly triumphant in the 7 Years' War. They had performed really well. Now, you guys may think today, British Army, of course they performed well. Historically speaking, the British Army has not been particularly strong. It's been the British Navy that's been incredibly strong since the 1600s. But at this point, Britain is in one of these phases where they do have a fairly powerful army. The other thing is, especially compared to the patriot cause in the colonies, Britain appears to be wealthy, and they appear to be wealthy enough to fight forever. But very few people understood at the time outside of the British government how broke Great Britain was. They did not have a lot of money. Their national debt, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that at the end of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, their national debt had doubled. And so now it's taking almost all the revenue they have just to pay their debt, just to service their debt. So Britain looks like a wealthy country, but they're not really a wealthy country. And people didn't realize how close to being broke they really were. And this is why they levied all those taxes after the French and Indian War on the colonists. And that, of course, is one of the things that leads to the war. So if you were a betting person at the beginning of this war, you're saying it's the British, they're going to win, it's going to be easy. Now, the war is broken into 3 phases. The early phase is fought in New England. The middle phase is fought in the middle colonies in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And the final phase of the war is going to be fought in the South. We're going to talk very briefly about this war. There's really only one battle or 2 battles I expect you to know the names of, and that come in handy as prior knowledge when you're on a test. So let's talk real quickly about the New England War. You guys see here, we've got Boston down here, okay, Boston, Massachusetts, Atlantic Ocean over here. Then the other places we're looking at are Montreal in Canada and Quebec City. And you're like, say what? Why are we looking at French Canada as part of the American Revolution? Well, glad you asked. The Siege of Boston lasted about a year. It starts in the middle of 1775. It ends in the spring of 1776. And the reason it ends is that a bunch of cannons from Fort Ticonderoga are stolen by American forces and trucked on over to Boston, where they're able to aim some cannon down at the British ships. And so the British withdraw their troops and they withdraw from Boston. And the British Army decides, we're going to live to fight another day. They pull out of there and they try to decide what the battlefield is where they want to win. After the British have left Boston, the American army has to figure out what to do. So Washington allows 2 of his generals, one of whom is fairly famous, Benedict Arnold, to form 2 separate forces that are going to go up and attack the French-Canadian province of Quebec. To do this, what they're trying to do is get into French Canada, which is now owned by the British after the 7 Years' War, but still has French-speaking people. And the Americans think, hey, maybe those people in Canada, maybe their province of Quebec, will join our provinces down here to become part of this revolution. So 2 American forces head up there. The first one, as you can see, goes over Lake Champlain up to Montreal. Then the other force goes overland through Maine, which is terrible territory to try and march and invade through. And they converge on Quebec City, trying to get Quebec to join the American colonies in rebellion. And it's a disaster. The French Canadians are actually pretty happy with the deal they've got with the British right now. They try really hard to get the French to join. It doesn't work. The British reinforce. The Americans lose a lot of people. Washington's army is still down here, and he saves them, and he says, let's start heading south, because I think I know where the British are coming next. And where they're coming next is, are you kidding me right now? Is New York. So my map isn't showing, but I guess I'm going to roll with it anyways. 1776, 77, 78 are the war in New York and New Jersey and parts of Pennsylvania. Washington realized that New York City's harbor is a great harbor. And the British know it's a great harbor. So the British are probably going to try and take it. And they're going to want to use the Hudson River to get up to the interior parts of New York State and try and secure the back ledge of the North and New England colonies. So Washington's army goes down. They occupy New York City. They're trying to keep the British from using the harbor, keep the British from using the Hudson River. And his men get down there. They're able to establish defensive lines. And in July of 1776, which is a date loaded with significance, right? This is when the Declaration of Independence is issued. The British bring their largest invasion force yet in. 30,000 troops. Now, that's a lot of troops today. That's a whole lot of troops back then. 30 big battleships bristling with cannon that can support the troops on the ground. Hundreds of supply ships, a supply tail of all the ammunition and weapons and everything they're going to need to wage this war. The Patriots lose that battle. It's sometimes called the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, Battle of Brooklyn, Battle of Long Island. Patriots lose the battle badly. Washington's forces are completely overwhelmed in the Battle of New York. But overnight, as the British are kind of regrouping, Washington manages to withdraw all his guys. First from Brooklyn to Manhattan, then from Manhattan over to New Jersey, then further into Pennsylvania, and they're going to live to fight another day. And so this is one of those cases where, was this a loss? Oh, yes, it was. The Battle of New York was a loss. However, it should have been the end of the war. If the British had played their cards right, the war's over. We don't even know who George Washington is today, except maybe as some traitor that existed several hundred years ago. But instead, the British did not press their advantage, and Washington is able to skillfully withdraw his men and live to fight another day, and that's huge. Now, the fights he has that other day are going to fight from New York City, which is at the very tippy, that New York City is at the very bottom of New York State. It's the very southernmost tip of New York State. And we call the rest of the state kind of upstate New York. So Washington's forces are going to be able to start marching up into the center of New York because the British have another army coming down towards them. In 77, they fight a major battle at a place called Saratoga. There's a couple of battles over a week and a half. They fight the British, they win on the battlefield, and there is a massive British surrender after the Battle of Saratoga. This was an enormous victory, not just because they won on the battlefield, which is, of course, important, but it's not just the surrender of an army. It's that Washington's armies proved we're actually somewhat competent. We can win battles. And with that, they get international support. And this is the turning point of the Revolutionary War, because now the French say, we would like to be on your side. And the French decide to send some military advisors. There are some Frenchmen who become absolutely critical in this war, including Marquis de Lafayette. And they're going to come in and be absolutely critical military advisors to our armies. And then within a few years, the French are also going to provide naval support that's going to win the war. Okay, so France is the big get here, but it's not the only one. After Saratoga, the French and Spanish governments agreed to fight together against Britain. And so now the British can't send everything they've got across the ocean towards the 13 colonies. They have to keep some of their navy back home. They have to keep some of their army back home because now they have a war on both sides of the Atlantic, just like the 7 Years' War. So now they can't concentrate on crushing us. Now they've got two wars to fight. And if you remember our little spoiler alert from the beginning of this, the British are already broke. So they're kind of in a bad situation by the time we get to 1778. Now, at the end of 78, we have the war move to the south. This war really does move from Boston down to New York, down to the Carolinas, and then back up into Virginia. It's kind of a north to south, then briefly south to north. 78, 79, 80, 81. This war is being fought primarily in the south. The British invade South Carolina. They invade at the port of Charleston. They invade down there because they believed the Southerners were a more loyalist population and they'd have a better chance. And you guys, think back to Unit 1, think back to Unit 2, think about our regions of British settlement. Remember that up north in the uppermost colonies, in the New England colonies, it was family units who came over, right? And they came over because they wanted to be free. They wanted to be left alone. When you think about those southern colonies, who was coming there? Was it families? No, it was single dudes, right? And they were coming because they wanted to grow crops, sell them to get cash. And who's the only people they can sell them to? The folks back in Britain. Is it any wonder that you found more loyalists in the South than you found in New England? The British invade down there because they think this loyalist population, they're going to give us housing, they're going to give us shelter, they're going to play ball with us, everything's going to be cool. Now, what they didn't expect was General Nathaniel Greene. Greene and Morgan are two of the great generals of this war. And Greene's forces, and Morgan's forces too, are going to invade into the South, and they're going to come down, they're going to get in a battle, and then they're going to run away. And then the British are going to chase them. And then they're going to get in another battle, and they're going to run away. And the British are going to chase them. And as the British are chasing Greene and Morgan's armies, a lot of them have to be thinking, oh, these terrible colonists, what do they think they're doing? They're never winning a battle on the battlefield, and then they run away. They're losers. Except, running away is the strategy, okay? This is where great generalship comes into play. Great generals know their armies, all right? And Greene and Morgan and Washington all understood our army is not good. We do not have a great army, okay? Compared to the British, we got nothing. But what can we do then to beat a superior force? Well, that superior force has to move all their supplies over an ocean, and then once they get across the ocean, they got to get unloaded from ships, and then they got to get put on wagons, and then they got to get sent out to us. What we're going to do, Greene and Morgan being the we here, what we're going to do is live off the land. We're not going to have hundreds of wagons following us. Our guys are going to be friendly to the civilians and make friends and allies out of the civilians. And then they can feed us out of their fields. And we don't have to have that whole supply line behind us. The British are now going to find themselves, number one, having to bring all their supplies with them. And number two, they're going to find that the civilians are not happy, friendly loyalists, that the civilians have now been turned into patriots. And how are they going to react to that? The British are going to burn down villages and homes and farms and create more enemies. They are an occupying force, right? Now, the British believe, somewhat justifiably, this is their land, but they're making enemies out of their own people. They never realized this war isn't necessarily about winning on the battlefield, which they're doing pretty well down here at this point. This war is about changing minds. We need to win the hearts and minds, which is a phrase that becomes really famous in later wars. We need to win the hearts and minds of the people. And the British were completely incapable of doing that. And the Patriots understood, as a smaller outnumbered force, it's the only weapon we've got. So the British forces, they fight, the enemy withdraws. Now they got to chase the enemy, and they fight again, and the enemy withdraws. The British forces over the course of these 4 years are going to get exhausted. Okay? They just can't march anymore. They can't get any more food to the front. They don't have boots that work anymore. Their guns are starting to fail. They are in really bad shape. Not only that, they've made the locals really angry. And they've driven all these people that they thought were loyal to them and kind of were in the beginning, they've made them become patriots. Again, if you think about modern wars, this is something we as a nation should be learning better. When we're in wars, we have had a tendency to make more enemies than friends in the way we wage war. And then we're surprised when it doesn't work out well, when in fact that is how we became a country. I am so sorry about these printer errors that are absolutely driving me crazy right now. So the British forces are exhausted. They've ticked off the locals. Locals are becoming patriots. And the British commander, Lord Cornwallis, says, all right. We're going to get a big resupply from the sea at Yorktown, Virginia, located on a peninsula. Let's get our army all brought up there. And then we can do one of several things once our whole navy is there, once our whole army is there. We can resupply, we could withdraw, we could land some reinforcements. We have lots of options once we get to Yorktown, or so he believed, because that's not what happened at Yorktown. Cornwallis's army comes in here, and Cornwallis's army is going up here, they come over here, they go down across to Yorktown, and behind them were the American forces. You see the British forces have formed a perimeter around Yorktown, perimeter around Gloucester, and then these green lines represent the French, led by Lafayette, who has a street named after him in Toledo, and the American forces that are coming up and coming across at Jamestown, all right? And the American and French forces are going to surround these guys on a peninsula. And you say, okay, no problem. They'll get off the peninsula with those great big ships they were bringing in. Problem. The French moved their whole fleet over here. And the French Navy cuts off the British. So the British are surrounded on land. They have no hope of being resupplied at sea. And the British are completely cut off. Now, does this mean they were defeated? No. There were still British troops occupying large swaths of New York, into Pennsylvania, parts of New Jersey. There were British soldiers that were able to take some parts. This is driving me absolutely bonkers. British soldiers who were able to secure parts of New England. But what the British government realizes is, could we keep fighting? Yes. Should we keep fighting? Probably not, because we're no closer to a victory now in 1781 than we were in 1775. And we don't really have enough money to keep going. So British negotiators met with American negotiators and said, what do we have to do to end this thing? They both name parties of diplomats to meet in Paris in 1783. And they negotiate a treaty that was more than fair to the United States. The United States gets all of the land east of the Mississippi and south of Canada, except for Florida. And Britain had to give Florida to the Spanish, who had originally had it back in the late 1400s, early 1500s. In return for this, the Americans have to treat the Loyalists right. Lots of Loyalists had their homes burned down, their possessions stolen, and the new United States have to reimburse the Loyalists who lost all their stuff. The question then becomes, now what? Congratulations, you've created the first democracy. You've created the first republic in over 1,000 years. How are you going to make that work? Okay, so originally they have a set of laws that had ruled during the Revolutionary War called the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, which we will talk about in great detail soon, under the Articles, each state was kind of its own country. So Virginia was its own nation, Massachusetts was its own nation, Connecticut, Rhode Island were their own nations, and the United States was kind of a club that they belonged to. So that's kind of where they're at. They're not really a country, they're 13 countries that all belong to a club. What happens to the army? Well, if you have a club and not a country, you don't really have an army anymore. So the soldiers who had fought in the Revolution basically go home. There's no national army left after the Revolutionary War. There are state militias who could be activated at any time, but there's no real force to defend your country if somebody decides to attack again. The states have to figure out how to rule themselves. Congratulations, Massachusetts. You're an independent country now. How are you going to do that? How are you going to run the place? How's this going to work? They don't know.
And that brings us back to the cemetery in Grand Rapids. The grave of Mr. Morrison is really a collection of unknowns for historians. No one today knows what his first name was. Nobody knows exactly when he served. Nobody knows exactly where he served, though some people kind of think he might have been in New York or Pennsylvania. No one knows when he got to Northwest Ohio, but we do have a good idea of why. After the Revolution, many veterans were promised land in the West as a benefit of their service, kind of like the GI Bill today. Mr. Morrison probably came west for a land grant, and at some point came even further west to Grand Rapids, Ohio, outside of Toledo. And at some point, probably in the early 1800s, he died here. Revolutionary War veterans and the new American people moved across this land and brought their presence and ideas to reshape the world with both positive and negative consequences.
So, at the cemetery, we talked a little bit about this. Veterans are moving west with some of the land grants they've got. Other people are pushing west, and their hearts and minds are filled up with these ideas of revolution. Now, there's a lot of pressure to live up to those ideals, right? These guys, like Mr. Morrison, fought a war that was about creating a democracy. But if we're a democracy, why can't everybody vote? They fought a war based on the idea that all men are created equal. But if that's the case, why is there slavery? They fought a war based on the idea that they were going to have this republic in which everybody had equal standing as a citizen, but there's this massive gap between rich people and poor people. So there's a lot of pressure in these early years of the republic to live up to this ideal. Who are we as a nation? What do we believe in? For women, it's an even larger question. Women were a big part of the revolution. They were supporting the armies step by step by step, okay? But their role in this new democracy was not very well defined. Women like Abigail Adams, the wife of our first vice president and second president, John Adams. Abigail Adams, when they get around to writing a constitution, famously reminds John Adams, remember the ladies, she expected women to have full rights in this new democracy. And that's not what happens. Instead, this concept of Republican motherhood is brought around. Now, we don't mean this like the Republican Party today. We mean this in the sense of a republic government, okay? Republican motherhood was this idea that a woman's job is something more than it had been in the past. In the past, domestic duties at home, like rearing the children and keeping things clean and making meals, they were seen as menial. And now they're saying, actually, women, that job you're doing at home is more important than ever. Because how are our children going to know these Enlightenment ideals our country is based on unless you are teaching them in the home? And so they kind of imbue women with the power to raise their kids on revolutionary ideals. And I suspect that men did this just to keep women happy and began creating the women's rights movement without knowing it. Women focused a lot on education. They focused a ton on educating the kids in their household. And as education grew for both boys and girls, educated people are not going to settle for being half citizens. And so you can kind of draw a straight line from Republican motherhood to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and the beginning of the women's rights movement. Is that what the founders of Republican motherhood intended? Probably not. Is it a really awesome side effect? Absolutely. These revolutionary ideals didn't just go across the continent like we talked about with Mr. Morrison. These revolutionary ideals went around the world. The successful revolution in the United States is going to inspire people in France, in Haiti, throughout Central America, throughout South America. The promise of these ideals is inspiring people around the world to no longer be monarchies, to no longer be in some sort of a dictatorship, but that the people ought to rule everywhere. The French Revolution is kind of the first one to happen in 1789 with the ideals of liberté, equalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. The Haitian Revolution is really ironic after this. 3 years after the French Revolution begins, the people of I think it was Saint Domingue was what it was called when it was a French territory. They revolt with a powerful leader, Toussaint Louverture, and they fight for almost 10 years to get, maybe even more than 10 years, to get the French to abandon Haiti, to get off that island and get self-rule. And with that comes the first sovereign black government in the Americas, a government led by black people with a majority black population. And if you think about, states in the American South, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, that have had majority black populations almost since the beginning of this country, most American states have not had the degree of self-rule that Haiti was able to earn for itself in the early 1800s. Then it spreads throughout South America and Central America with men like Simón Bolívar and the Mexican Revolution. And all of these intend to bring power back to the people. Not all of them actually do, but that's the intention, because the promise of America's ideals is a boundless promise, right? Our country makes people believe I can be free. I can be equal. That's who we are. That's our founding ideal. This ideal inspired people here. It inspired black people. It inspired women. It inspired people of different religions because, yes, there were Jewish people and Muslims in early America. These ideals inspired lots of people. And the crime is that we didn't always live up to them, right? And we still don't live up to those ideals today. The American ideals were incredibly powerful. They spread faster than COVID throughout the whole world, and they positively infected millions and millions of people around the world. And they're ideals that we need to live up to today to create the kind of America that I think most of us believe we can still have. So, thanks for sticking with me, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.